Recording. Hey guys, welcome back to the From Mourning to Meaning Summit, where we're going to show how to break through intolerable grief and return to meaningful living. I'm Laura Isabel, and today I have with me Kara Jones. Hello, Kara Jones.
Hi, Laura. Hi, everybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, you guys might not know Kara Jones from here, but believe it or not, she actually interned 3 years at Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. So I thought that was pretty awesome. Don't know about you, Kara, but I find that exciting.
It was very exciting. It was formative for how I work too with grief. And we can talk about that if you like as well.
Awesome. Definitely. I would definitely like to hear your story on that. Definitely. But before we get to that, before we get to grief, before we get to, she's a co-founder of both the Creative Grief Studio and 𝘀𝗵𝗏. But before we get to all that, I want to hear a little bit about you and your story with grief, because I imagine that's the beginning of how it got you here. So I kind of want to hear a little bit about that. So if you can share that with me, that would be awesome.
Sure. So I definitely was an artist and a writer, always. But in 1999, my husband and I experienced the death of our first child at birth. We then had 2 other birth deaths. And those experiences, they're pretty radical.
Yeah.
That point where you think you're going to hear like, it's a boy, and that's not what you hear.
Mm-hmm.
It changes how you think about your identity. Like, am I still a mother? It changes how your family system works. We had 2 older surviving living children. And so are they still a brother and a sister? It changes your partnership, like how you communicate with each other, how, your intimacy levels, just it changed everything. We also found that we had generations of our family who were still alive at that point who had survived World War II.
Wow.
And they had a very different approach to grief. Mm-hmm. They had seen so much grief. There was so much unprocessed on the sort of community grief level, the collective grief level. And there was very much a push for the war's over, get back to it. There was a lot of things left unprocessed. So here we come in 1999, wanting to go to grief support and wanting to take our kids to grief camp and do all of these things. And then you've got this older generation of the family that's like, what are you doing?
Yeah, definitely.
Right. So the dynamics of the family change. And then just culturally, right, everything blows up. My husband he was already on his paternity leave.
Oh, okay.
Baby died. I had a C-section, so came home and was recovering. Got a phone call one of the days after I was home, maybe 2 or 3 days after I was home. And I picked up the extension. This was back in the landline days. I picked up the extension in the bedroom, and my husband picked up in the living room. And I heard my husband's boss say to him, well, I'm calling to see when you're coming back to work. It's not like you brought a baby home or anything. So we don't understand why you can't come back to work. So that immediate 3 days paid bereavement leave versus paternity leave and who gets what and workers' rights. And his boss was a doctor, by the way, an MD.
Wow.
Can you see like all the levels of these things like exponentially? This was not just like our baby died and we were individually affected, but this was like exponential through the systems of our very beings and lives on every level.
Definitely.
Spent 2 years seeking support ourselves because obviously that we needed that first. We had no language I didn't really voice a lot of these things until several years in, because I didn't, all we felt was shame and guilt that my husband couldn't try to go back to work because that's what they expected.
Yeah, of course.
And if he didn't, and we didn't get paid and we lost the house and blah, blah, right?
Yeah. And it's crazy because right now, what you're saying, it just blew my mind in the sense of there's so many things that when women go through this, or families go through this, because it's not just a woman thing, it's the entire family goes through this, and you don't really think about some of these things. For example, when you said it wasn't just that we didn't bring a baby home. I mean, is it brother and sister? Is it, like all these little things that you don't think about? I mean, I personally have never had a stillborn. So in my head, it didn't go to that extent, but it's so true when you say that. There's so much more than just a death. It's so much change, because we've been so long waiting this, and we've been so long having these new titles and having these new routines that we structured in our mind and said this is what it's going to be, and our lives changed. But when it comes out the way it does, you kind of think about it and you're like, hold on, everything has just changed. Like, you think nothing's changed because it hasn't come to the world yet, but no, everything has changed. Not just about you and the way you feel, but everything has just changed. It's crazy. It just blew my mind, because I honestly didn't think to that extent. And it's so true what you're saying. And it's so true.
And I think so many people don't think to that extent until you're knee deep in it yourself.
Yeah,
you know what I mean? I think that's part of the grief illiteracy in our world in general, in our modern Western, medicalized version of things. I think that until we fall headfirst into it, and this is a theme that's continued. This is 20 years now I've been doing this kind of work and stuff, right? 20 plus years. It's something that comes up over and over again when I reach out to work with other people or with friends or family. People will say, I didn't realize there was this whole entire world out here. I didn't know there was a grief support group for siblings. I didn't know that you could have grief when a pet dies. I didn't realize there were, you know what I mean? Like, people, until you're in it and you need it,
you don't think of it.
I just think people don't realize it's out here. And then a lot of times what's very sort of what does reach people, what's very sort of pop culture-y, is sort of like the 5 stages.
Yeah.
Warden's tasks, grief work, which, all those words are sort of, all those things are sort of like, well, in some ways they're misused when they reach that pop culture level. Because I will say that Kubler-Ross spent the entire rest of her career trying to correct misuse of what she was talking about originally. But when you reach that pop culture level, there's something very sort of capitalistic productivity grind space about it. Do the work, finish your tasks, right? Get through the stages, so that you get to acceptance and you can get back to productivity. These things are so intermeshed, and yet our grief illiteracy just, culturally and individually, until you're in the middle of it. And even when you're in the middle of it, you have to seek the language.
Yes, even while you're in the middle of it, you sometimes have no idea what is actually happening, or if it's even related to your grief, or if you just think you're going crazy, basically. So it's true, not only when you're out of it, but even when you're in it. So imagine when you're out of it, how non-understanding it can be, how mixed signals, mixed communicated it can be. Definitely. Now, I know also, so Kara actually in the beginning didn't want to come here and didn't want to talk because she encountered some difficulties when she herself was trying to go through grief. And the first thing I told her was, Kara, you are bringing all that to the table, because you don't know how many people out there are probably feeling the same exact way. So I do want to ask you, because I would love for you to share. I know that when you went through this, you did seek counseling because you felt you needed it. You did need that help for it. And I know you did encounter some problems. So if you can let us know a little bit about what made you go get counseling, which is probably obvious, but what actually gave you the initiative to go out there? Because there's always something that pushes you a little bit more to do that. And then also, what did you encounter exactly during that process?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the things that I think, just because my husband and I have like a high communication around sort of our emotional connection and our intimacy levels and stuff, because we are a mixed race couple. And so there's sort of a heightened awareness for us about like, where are we in space and is it safe? And, you know, when the kids are little, are we in safe space? Like there was a lot of that sort of stuff was already heightened.
Yeah.
And so when grief entered the picture and sort of complicated everything, you know, it felt sort of automatic to us in a way, because the hospital sort of handed us a bunch of pamphlets and said, there's a grief support group that happens here, and there's a grief support group that happens here. And so it wasn't even counseling necessarily at first, it was grief support groups, which the first sort of issue we encountered with it was those groups met monthly at the hospital where our baby died. So going back to that hospital, in the same building, on the same campus, in the same parking lot, a month later to get grief support, it just felt very, you know, other grief supports we encountered, you know, they're running on a shoestring. They get the basement room of a church. That's where they can hold their grief support group. So I'm a disabled woman. And though I didn't have accessibility issues in the moment, it was because I am disabled, those things are top of mind. I thought to myself, this is not terribly accessible, which, you know, churches in the United States don't have to comply with ADA. I know there's exceptions to it, but I'm just saying in terms of grief support, that puts a little wrench in accessibility. The other thing we sort of encountered was going into some of these spaces, they were entirely and completely all white people. Facilitators, coordinators, other group members. And we kind of went like, okay. Again, it took us a little while to have language for it. It was enough that it sort of sat with us, but it took us a little while to get to a place of questioning things. My husband was a tech guy, and I came through, my college class was I was in the English department, and this was the first time, like outside of engineering, you know, and the robotics guys, that the whole campus got computer labs. We were the first class to come through that actually had email. We could communicate with our professors, would give us assignments by email and stuff. This was, you know, new stuff. So in '99, when we encountered these issues around reaching out for a support group physically in the real world, IRL, we kind of both looked at each other and went, I wonder what's possible. And at the time, Yahoo Groups was a thing. I realize that doesn't exist anymore, but at the time. And so we kind of set up, we had our little press set up because I was already publishing things, the writings I was doing about grief and loss through 𝘀𝗶𝗄. So we set up a 𝘀𝗶𝗄, a grief support group online. And I'll tell you, to this day, I'm friends with several of those folks, really good friends. One of them, I have an ongoing chat on my phone for all these years. Many of us have met in person since then, and multiples of us were disabled. And part of the reason the accessing of that group was sort of like novel to us at the time, and really sort of cinched in a way that, like, no, virtual, don't discount virtual. It doesn't mean any less because it's virtual, was because we were disabled, and we were all, whether we used the language of being disabled or not, whether we were physically disabled or dealing with mental illness, we all had glitches in real life with accessing grief support. So again, it took a few years for these things to sort of formulate, and for me to sort of kind of see where these things connected and start to have language about it. But they were experiences we were having immediately. Yeah. So, you know, so there's that. And then a couple of years into we had been seeking support. We'd been facilitating these groups. I had been talking to some different foundation kind of groups that were had, you know, chapters around the world and stuff. I kind of transitioned into peer support facilitator and then into like paraprofessional facilitator. And so we started kind of checking out grief conferences, like what did that mean? What did grief education mean? What did it look like to go into these spaces? And the very first one we went to, my husband and I were sitting at a table, it was one of those round 8-person tables, like a conference room, with the speaker doing the overhead and whatnot. And the couple next to us was a lesbian couple who'd also had a stillbirth. And so we, the 4 of us sort of connected immediately because stillbirth kind of, does that. Kind of, and so the speaker comes up, and this particular training session and speaker had done research and was doing training about grief and gender. And ultimately, her premise was sort of that men are from Mars, women are from Venus thing. Men grieve this way and women grieve this way. And it was so stark that the 4 of us just sort of all kind of started looking at each other because, they kind of said to us, wait, we're both women, but we don't grieve alike. Are we supposed to be doing this the same? And Hawk and I sort of looked at each other, he's a man, I'm a woman. We were very similar in our styles. And we, so again, are we doing it wrong? And the thing I just noticed about those spaces was how immediately shame cooks up for people. Well, the 4 of us immediately went to, are we doing it wrong?
Yeah, of course.
That doesn't, and this wasn't like, this wasn't like a proposed or a theory, or this was like, this is how it is. Men grieve this way, women grieve this way. So the 4 of us stuck around and for the Q&A, and we asked a lot of questions, and we were met with defensiveness. There was no professional humility. There was no, this is a segment of research I did, and that doesn't account for very different experience. It was just simply
Black
defensiveness.
Yeah,
just very. How can I not end up in a space where I'm encouraging people to creatively explore their grief experiences, understanding that grief is a social justice issue, having come out of all of this?
Oh yeah, of course.
This was just, so yeah, those were some of the things that kind of set me on this path that I was hesitant when you reached out to me, because a lot of times people reach out to me and they're doing a very, grief is the great equalizer. Once one of us experiences grief, we all understand grief. Like, it's a very simplified, and when I come in there asking these questions, that defensiveness often comes back. And so that was part of my hesitation.
No, and I think that's great. I think that's great because it shows that we already know, us who grieve understand that not everybody grieves the same way. Not everyone's experience is the same way. Even, for example, I lost my father. I actually had a friend who years later came to me and she's like, everyone just keeps telling me they understand and I'm getting really frustrated. So I wanted to write to you because I thought you'd be the one that would most understand. And I told her, I remember telling her, and maybe it was too harsh, but I told her, I honestly can't tell you I understand because your experience is so different, but I'm here willing to listen to you and try to understand you. So even when you lose the same type of figure, like, for example, you, in your case was a stillborn and you met that lesbian couple that also had a stillborn, the experiences are so different. And I think it's so important for people to understand that not only is the grieving process different, but you're not going to agree with every single grieving process, and you're not going to feel that it's right for you. There's some things that you might feel all right. There's some things that you might not. So if you do go to a grief counseling or grief coaching or a therapist or anything of that sort, and it's something that you honestly do not feel comfortable, do not feel right, I think it's very important to question that, not just to say, well, I have to do this because I'm grieving. No, it's important for you to feel true to yourself, to feel comfortable. It's not easy. It's not a happy go joy thing either, but at least feel comfortable where you're at and feel comfortable enough to be open and vulnerable. And if you don't feel that way, then it's very important to find something else, because there is something out that's suitable for you. What's suitable for one may not be suitable for another. And there's so many things out there, so many theories, especially older theories that have evolved. And some people still think in the older version. Some people think more modern ways. So everyone's so different. So it's really about finding what's fit for you. Everyone grieves differently, and everyone needs to recover in a different way. And yes, I use that word recover a little bit loosely, because that all depends on everyone's thoughts. But you know what I mean? So that's why I felt it was very important. Although I know you sometimes get negative lashes because of that. I thought it was very important to bring it forward, because you're not the only one. And I want to make sure that people understand that they might be going through that, and it's okay. You don't have to be ashamed of that. You don't have to feel that out of it. You don't have to feel like you don't belong, or that you don't have anyone to help you, because you do. You just haven't gotten to the correct person yet, and you will find it. You just continue. Exactly. Yet.
I love that. And Laura, that's true even in my own experience. I had my first stillbirth in 1999 and my second stillbirth in 2010. And by 2010, my world was different. I had so much structure around me that we didn't have in 99. I knew the risks, and so my second stillbirth was completely different.
I believe
than my first, right? So even in my own, I can't even know what grief is going to be like and what the process and the experience is going to be like in my own similar circumstance. You know what I mean?
Of course.
So I say that to people a lot in the education spaces. Like, I couldn't even understand how different these two stillbirths would be for myself. So how could I possibly, you are the expert on your experience, because I can't possibly know. I can ask questions, right? I can encourage you to find, I think that was the difference for me. I had encouragement to find my own agency. Right. And so I can encourage people to find that agency for themselves. And it's interesting, you come up against it also, though, as a professional, because sometimes people do come and they expect you to be an expert. Well, you're the expert. So how does this work? And sometimes when you respond with, I couldn't possibly know those answers for you, they're surprised. They're surprised that that there isn't an answer, or there isn't, the stages aren't the way to do it.
I think sometimes it's so desired for sometimes when you're in the middle of it, it's a desire for you to have stages, because you want to be able to know that you're getting out of it. So it's something that maybe it's something that if they weren't in the situation, they'd understand and they wouldn't question it. But because they're in it and there's so much wanting to get out, which is perfectly understandable, they want to have that measurable stage where they can say, okay, now I'm here, I'm almost there, I'm a day closer to a brighter life. So
so it's interesting, like these dynamics go both ways, and I just find that if we can kind of hold spaces loosely and sort of hold them open with, questioning, it's less likely that people will encounter shame. And shame is such a huge complicator for grief experience. Grief is one thing, but shame is another. And, when shame cooks up and sort of connects with the grief experience, it can feel so oppressive and so like, oh, this is never going to end. If we can have those spaces of like just being able to ask the questions. A lot of times, one of the things I sent to you that I think you're going to share with folks is the permission slip, the excerpt from the permission slip book. And where that permission slip came from, the idea of it was, it came from a particular person here on the island who was doing that. But I started working with other people. Like, so in your own grief experience, like how much of it are you living as a space of obligation? I have to do it this way. I have to set my grief aside because now it's Christmas. I it's been a year, so I have to set it aside. I can't mention them on their birthday anymore. Like, how much of it is coming out of obligation?
Yeah.
And would it help you to write yourself a permission slip? You don't need permission from me. Would it help you to write yourself a permission slip for whatever? And so those 1,000 permissions just came out of talking with people over, years of what was happening in their grief experiences, what was sort of maybe even unconsciously driving some of the grief experience that was feeling stuck.
Yeah. No, and that's definitely true, because I know society already has a kind of a mentality around it, right? So after a certain time period, they think it should be over. They think you need to get up and get going and return back to normal and get back at it. But I think we ourselves sometimes put ourselves in that pressure as well, especially when it's the first time we've gone through that. For example, like you've said, it's the holidays. I need to get dressed and put on a smile. It's Saturday and everyone's coming over. I need to pretend everything's good and have the house cleaned and everything perfect. I'm not allowed to look like I'm a total mess right now,
Honey, yeah.
So it's really nice to have those permission slips, and we're definitely going to get to them. So tell me a little bit about what exactly, because as I mentioned before, she is the co-founder of both the Creative Grief Studio and 𝘀𝗵𝗄. So I know that the way you go about your grief lessons, I should say, or the creativity around grief is a little bit different, and you have a lot of questioning to oneself. So tell me a little bit about that process, and how it might help, how you feel it helps individuals figure it themselves out more than anything, right?
Yeah. So my private practice is at griefandcreativity.com.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm doing creative grief education work at creativegriefstudio.com. And that is one of the spaces I co-founded. And 𝘀𝗵𝗄 is sort of archived now, but that was the imprint name we came up with to self-publish some of the things we were doing. That group that I mentioned, where we did online support groups at Yahoo Groups a million years ago, that group, we collaborated and created something called the Dictionary of Loss, where we were redefining words or making up new phrases or new words to try and describe what was happening for each of us. And so that material is sort of archived online still, but that was something that Hawk and I collaborated on back in the day. So my private practice today is working with people who are directly grieving themselves. And then the creative grief education piece is I'm working with other helpers or support people who are then directly working with people who are grieving, right? So it's sort of one step back, sort of this is directly with people who are grieving. This is people who are working with people who are grieving.
Yeah.
But I think both sides of it for me have grief education pieces to them. So that's why you'll see I talk about my work a lot of time as grief education. Or as a grief educator, I will say I'm a grief educator or a heartist, because I really think it's about heart making instead of just art making. I am an artist, I'm a visual artist, I'm a writer, but, and I have done things in art therapy and music therapy and, energy work and all of these different things, but it's not one of those modalities for me. It's because not everybody is gonna vibe with visual art.
Yeah.
Right. So some people are very metaphorical. They love, those like grief as a dance. So grief comes into a dance hall. What music is playing? Is it wearing dance shoes? What kind of dance does it do? Is it dancing outside, not in a dance hall? Some people will vibe with that, sort of externalizing grief, making it a character, giving it characteristics, exploring imaginatively with it. Other people are very literal. And that kind of metaphorical play just isn't going to take them anywhere. And so, this kind of heart work for me includes this kind of creative conversation, right? And so for someone who maybe is on a more literal path, although this kind of tool works with anybody, but who's maybe has a more literal interpretation of things, and they're having that very obligation-based grief experience. I might invite them, do they want to explore a little bit about where did this sense of obligation come from? And then I have this worksheet, and something that we teach at Creative Grief Studio called the Big Book of Grief Rules. And it's kind of, it has little prompts that you then fill in the answer to. So it's a little bit of journaling, right? A little bit of, it can be very sort of diary-ish, you know, can be very, you could answer it with poetry, I suppose, if you want to, if you're that kind of writer. But so it's very like, where did I first hear the idea that the holidays and grief are exclusive? Who was the first voice that told me that? When I hear that come up and I try to do that now, whose voice is it saying that? Did I internalize it and I'm saying it to myself? Or is it an obligation still based on somebody else? So it's that kind of exploration. And that we can have creative conversations about whatever your responses are to those sort of prompted fill-ins, right? So both in the work that I'm doing with people directly, I'm using those kinds of tools with them to just talk about their grief experience. And then on the education side with the helping professionals, we're helping them understand how to use these tools with the people they're working with. And part of that came out of just Kath Duncan, who co-founded the Creative Grief Studio with me. She and I both had the experience of like, oh, there's so much grief. Like this is, because humans are mortal, this is a never ending wave. Like there's just never, there can, and I say this to the people that we work with at the studio too, the people who are getting into coaching or who are social workers or who are, you know, if you have any sense of like jealousy or envy or competitiveness with other people doing grief work come up, please hover there. Don't shame yourself for it or try to shut it down or ignore it. Like hover there a little bit and ask yourself, like, what's happening here? Like, are they doing something I'm interested in? Is that a relationship, like a person I might want to reach out to? Like ask yourself, because there can never be enough of us opening space to talk about grief experience. Like there will never be enough of us to meet the need, because the need is never ending.
Definitely.
And so, you know, please use those cues of competitiveness, you know, understand that like capitalism sets us up to do that, to, you know, sets us up to, oh, I have to have a practice. It has to look like this. It has to be successful. Hold that stuff loosely, like hover there, ask yourself, right? What's happening here? And even with people that I'm working with who are directly grieving, you know, so-and-so is recovered. Their person died 2 years ago and I'm 5 years out. And how come my life doesn't look like that? Oh, honey, the diversity of what grief experience looks like, you know, and how do you hover there without shame, right? Without shaming yourself about it, and ask questions. And what do I need? What is it I'm seeing in that person that makes me, you know, what's there? You know, are there questions you want to ask them? Is there something there that you want to aim toward? Is there, you know?
Yeah, definitely, because there's always an underlying factor. I mean, what I love most about the way that you go about your practice is the fact that it's not about, like you mentioned, it's not about grief is going to take on this form and you're going to feel these emotions. It's basically asking yourself, what am I feeling?
Yeah.
Where is that coming from? Is that from me or from something else? And is that really grief, or is it another feeling that was given to me? So now I feel I have to embody it. And sometimes when you look at someone else and you want what they have, or you're wondering about them, there's something underlying there. There's something more than that. It's not just about envying someone. It's not just about wanting what they have. It's not just about jealousy. It's actually about an underlying factor that's there. And it's not about that person. It's about you. So it's really asking yourself, what is it that I want that they seem like they've got it? They seem, because they don't always have it, but it seems to us that they do.
Yeah.
So it's really interesting because a lot of
You froze up, Laura. I think I'm. I think I lost you.
I hear you. Oh, I see you now.
Oh, there you are. Okay, great.
Awesome. So, but yeah, like I was saying, so a lot of times, I think when you're inside of it, you want all these step by step, but they don't realize that not having all the answers in the beginning and really taking that time in the beginning to understand yourself versus what you should be feeling or what you could be feeling sometimes will take you there even faster, because you're really zoning in onto what you feel, what you need, what you want. So that's a really nice way to think about it. That's something very different. That's a different way to think about it that can be a very nice and fitting way as well.
Yeah, and I think also, just even mentioning something like that with people, talking about it, can take us out of the individual aspects of it too. Like sometimes it really just is that sort of capitalist keeping up with the Joneses stuff. Like it's not even ours. It's not even, it's that something else has put upon us this idea of success in whatever way, like work-wise or health-wise or grief-wise, and so like even sometimes just mentioning things like that, people go, oh, oh, okay, that's interesting. I never thought about that before. And that goes with a lot of things. Like a lot of times I'll have folks like shame will come up, like it doesn't look like how that person looks. And we'll talk a little bit about like, what are the differences? Like, what are the different things you see, or what is, and sometimes there are issues of access. Like that's just real. Like that other person was able to access something that is not accessible for this person right now.
Yeah.
Whether in terms of, disability, income, location, whatever. And that's not like an individual fault.
Of course.
That all of these different layers from the individual to the sociocultural are all playing parts. Yeah, and a lot of times in grief experiences, especially, people don't hear that. And so they don't make those connections, and they're carrying around the shame. Definitely. That they can't do. I can't do it, right? And
no, of course.
Really, yeah.
Yeah, which it's horrible, because if you already think of all the emotions that you feel, grief, to add something else upon there, that has nothing to do with it at all. That's just a little bit sad, to feel like they have another bag to carry, and it doesn't even have anything to do with it. It's just a misunderstanding of the idea. So definitely.
And definitely like structural inequities, like we're seeing this now through, especially in the time of COVID. And there were conversations about it happening prior, but especially now, the access to mental health support, and the rates at which COVID is affecting the Black community is very different than other communities. And so, resources like radical death studies, Black in mental health, some of the different, folks who are organizing and starting to create pools of resource and funding for people to access therapy and stuff, that some of that's real. I've certainly read enough accounts from people who had, multiple experiences of marginalization, say, I find it very hard to go into these very white spaces for grief support, because it's treated as if it's a one-time event. Someone died and, that's it. That's the event of grief. But I'm dealing with ongoing, like, sort of cultural trauma on top of. Yeah. And so going into those spaces, the infrastructure for understanding that or holding that space open isn't always there. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. How can I amplify? What can I do? Like, yes, absolutely.
Definitely. No, and everything really ties in. And so it's not just the loss of one thing. Everything ties in, and it even goes
Yeah.
back deeper to your history, to your to the past. So everything just ties in, and just one goes to another. You never really forget one and go to the next. It's everything ties into one. So
Yeah, you know how I was
it's a
saying
big
to you
part.
earlier, we had an older living generation of our family who'd lived through World War II.
Yeah.
And there
Mhm.
was sort of this cultural pressing to like get on with it. And
Yeah.
so the collective processing of grief and the individual processing of grief didn't really happen. I tell you, I have been sitting with that that reality a lot in this past year or so, because I see for my grandchildren's generation, they're being pressed to get back to school.
Mhm.
You can't get back to school. We need to get back. The schools need to open. This needs to happen. This needs to come on. We need to get back to work. Open the offices again. We got to. I'm sitting here and I'm thinking, my grandkids are 10 and 16 and 18. And I was thinking, are we creating yet another generation where we have rushed this collective grief process?
Mhm.
And I mean, maybe not necessarily for my individual family, because our daughter is extremely grief literate because she grew up with us, but for that generation though,
Yeah.
and the ways that we saw it with the older generation coming through World War II, like I have really been sitting with that and wrestling with that for the past year or so. Not sure what the answer is, not sure what the answers are, or
There's
how to approach, but
Yeah, there's definitely some things that are a lot bigger than us that we can have an idea, but we don't know the exact answers because we haven't seen the other side of it yet, right?
yeah.
But we can definitely tie things back to history, and which goes back to making it a smaller version. This is a bigger version of something that we were already talking about, and that's, am I thinking of this or am I feeling this way because it's something that I feel or that it has been brought up to me? So it's kind of the same way, just in a bigger scale, right?
Yeah.
So that's something to think about. And going back to that as well, since we're already on that topic of, is it me or is it something that came onto me? Let's hear about your permission slips. I know you mentioned a little bit about it, but what are we offering listeners today?
Yeah. So I have this ebook called 1,000 Permissions. And how it started was, there was a man who lived on the island where I live, who he actually had died before I got here. But as I was starting to make my way around the island, I noticed in like different businesses and people's homes and stuff, there were these permission slips. And so I started asking people, like, what's the deal? They told me about this man, and that before he died, he would just take an interest in people. And so one of the famous stories of it was the receptionist at his dental office. He knew she was a painter. And so every time he would come in for his dental cleanings and stuff, he would say to her, "Have you painted lately?" And she would say, "Oh, in work and the kids." So he would turn over the appointment cards, to the blank side, and he would write for her, "You have permission to paint." And it kind of became a thing that he did with people. And so I just kind of was sitting with it and thinking, there's something in that around our grief experiences and just our life experiences, grief aside or grief included, but just as the bigger life picture. Why don't we give ourselves permission? Why do we, where are we stuck? How are we stuck? Why are we, And so I started writing permission slips for myself. I started sharing the idea as a prompt that other people could use. And then eventually I started doing it with people. And I collected up over the years 1,000 of these permissions. And so with people's permission, of course, we collected them together into a book, and we published these 1,000 permission slips with blank slips at the end for people to make their own. So this freebie is 40 pages out of that book, including the page that has the blank slips so you can write your own. And these 40 pages have permission slips on them that have something to do with grief experience. Okay, so the wider book has lots of different kinds of permission slips, but these 40 pages kind of, there's something on each page that came out of someone's grief experience.
Mhm.
And you know, it's just an encouragement for people to just explore that. You know, just what permission do you need to give yourself? No one else needs to give it to you. But would it help to give yourself permission
Yeah,
in some
definitely.
part of the grief experience?
I think that's honestly, I think that's a great idea. I think that is something that's very beneficial because we obviously think about it sometimes, but having that there will help us give us ourselves that permission. So go ahead and go download that, see what it's like, go try to give yourself some permission, read those 40 that might help you, and then create your own and see what you can give yourself permissions for to help yourself during the grieving process, to help yourself get back to how you were and feel better, because I'm sure there is something there that you're not allowing yourself to do. So that is great. Thank you so much for that offer.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
thank you so much for joining us. I'm so glad that you decided to join us, even though you were not sure about it. But like I said, I'm sure someone out there can connect with what you're saying and feels the same way. And I'm sure you've helped them realize that it's not them, that they can continue trying to find that help that they need.
Yeah.
So definitely, I really appreciate you coming on, and I appreciate you giving that awesome offer and having your chat. And thank you again so much.
Sure thing, Laura. Thank you for having me here today. And thank you, everybody.
Awesome. You're welcome. I'll speak for them because I'm sure that's what they'll say. Awesome. Well, guys, for tomorrow, I'll come back for another From Morning to Meaning interview series. Don't miss it. Bye, guys.